And to start us off, are there any burning questions that anyone has for any of our speakers?
I was struck by the story that Gerald was talking about the idea of motion and the Navajo traveling to spaces to shear sheep or to many things that involve motion and traveling. And the film, he suggests, had spent a few minutes just on the weaving part of it. So to me, the importance was the activity, the traveling, the motion. And it reminded me of a story that I had heard one while ago about a very similar thing, in which it was a story of a Northern California woman who was teaching a class of weaving. And her class was a classroom full of primarily non-Aboriginal students, and so the daily activity was to go out into the fields and then come in. But each activity, each moment, each thing that they did was forefronted by a song. So they go out and cut the grasses and they'd sing a song. They'd come in and prepare the grasses and they'd sing a song. All along there was singing. And so this happened over a week, but through several days as this was going on, one of the students eventually put up their hand and questioned the teacher and says, excuse me, when are we going to start weaving baskets? That's what I'm here for. That's what I signed up. And she said, and this is the most profound statement I thought, it's similar to what Gerald is talking about. She said, you know, a basket is a song made visual. And, you know, that statement struck me over and over, and it was like what Gerald was talking about. It's not the weaving. The weaving was the result of the walking. The baskets were a result of the songs. Now, we have come through, and what Megan and others have talked about was a period in which all those songs were literally wiped out from all our communities. And it's taken us over 150 years or less to recover those songs through cultural annihilation, through modernity and other processes. And I remember in the late 70s, Robert Hoole and I, in this room, we were at a conference together, the first conference gathering of Indigenous artists from across Canada in Manitoulin Island, in which we were an angry group of young artists. And we had gathered there to talk about really interesting issues of representation and funding. And a number of the cultural institutions were there. And we were full of piss and vinegar, I guess some would say. But you know, we said we should have been in the National Gallery, we should be in the Art Gallery of Ontario, we should be funded by Canada Council, on and on and on. Well, they didn't even listen to us really at the time, but we were upset and we were mad, you know. And so this went on, and I thought, you know, in retrospect, Robert, if you will, you know, at that time I thought, you know, we weren't that good enough yet, you know. I thought we were young, we were fairly immature, and it took years and years and years of that push. I think we were there as young people trying to find those songs. I think we were there trying to articulate what it was that we were missing for the last 100 years or so. And it was really a critical moment for me to begin my career working with artists and trying to articulate what it was and why were we missing those songs? Where did those songs go to, and how do we recover those songs? And you know, it's taken a while. It's taken, this is 34 years ago now, I think, Robert. It was a long time ago. And you know, over those 34 years, I think the maturity, not only the maturity of artists, the artists started to get better and better and better, more articulate. We started to understand what it was that was missing. We started to understand our relationship with the rest of the world, the community at large. We started to understand the conditions in which we had come from and which we were going. You know, this is all led by artists. At the time, it was all artists. We had no curators that were full-time curators. It was all artists. And I kept thinking, you know, what happens? In my mind, the question, what happens after artists go? You know, the artists were the leaders all the time. And each moment that we went through all the years, there was the artists that were establishing, not just, it wasn't even resisted, there was nothing to resist, it was really something to tackle. And I felt that it was a critical moment for us to begin thinking about, over those years of development. And you know, finally, many of the exhibitions over the 30 years have resulted in what we're seeing here today. And I haven't seen the show yet, and I'm really looking forward to it, but a number of the artists I know and I've worked with over the years. But you know what was important for me, and I think it's important for this show and important for the National Gallery, that the maturity, particularly in this country, the maturity of the art world, the work on a part of the artists, the recovery of those songs, and I think that the young people that are engaged, not only in the art today, but in this exhibition, I think that they have discovered and they have found those songs once again and are singing them very, very loud and very, very proudly. So I just want to make that observation. So thank you very much.
Does anyone else have any questions? Marc Maillet.
Diana, you talked about the brutality of the art market. And it reminded me of the story that Venkat told us about his mentor and the artist who went from his country to Magicien de la Terre, became very rich and famous, as you said, only to commit suicide in Japan. Is that the brutality of the art world works both ways. It can be, of the art market, I should say. It can be brutal to the artists who need the money to continue to work, and it can be brutal to the artists who get an awful lot of money. It also becomes brutalizing in their career, as you know, unless you have great personal strength and control. Venkat, those drawings are very, very powerful when you remember them in the context of the suicide of this artist. I wanted to ask you if this experience had an effect on you. Did it frighten you? Of course it made you very sad, but what was the effect on you personally, and did you learn a lesson from that and what that lesson might be?
Actually, my uncle, I inspired by him every time, and he found me actually. And when I was in child, so I inspired by nature somehow. And when I come to do Bhopal as my uncle's house, and then I inspired by other different things, thoughts. But when he passed away and society in Japan, then I was completely disturbed because my life was a very different. I was a painter, so a signboard painter. So because I was going on two ways. One side, I was following my tradition. One side, I was following my own journey. It means, only I have taking money from the various job, but focusing my tradition and because I never forget my tradition, so I just how can introduce, actually my way was there, how can introduce my thoughts, my myths, my tradition through the visual art. And my uncle also every time said me, do best, do better, or present your thoughts. Don't say, it means you say, you can say something your way, but what are you doing? Please keep on the mind and present on canvas, actually. So every time I'm trying to do something new on my own, how can do better? Just actually, I have no any words for my uncle, and every time I say, I can't say because without he, I'm nothing. So.
This is a question for Megan and for Gerald, because one of the kind of boxes that which could be a nice box or maybe it's an ugly box, I don't know what kind of box it is, but is this word Indigenous that we're sort of contending with, which we haven't really talked about. And also this idea of cosmopolitanism that's kind of coupled with it. And when I think about Indigenous, to me it kind of doesn't really exist because it's kind of homogenizing, but we can kind of think about what it means through seeking commonalities. And what those commonalities might cause tension with this idea of cosmopolitanism. But my question is, how do you think of this term Indigenous, and what is the kind of content of that in terms of building a community, an international community, an identity? How does that relate to our specificity in our own places? That kind of thing. And how does being Indigenous relate to being cosmopolitan in the way that we are in the art world by coming to this place together?
I don't know if I can answer that. I suppose I like the term Indigenous or Indigeneity. I think for a long time, it's interesting, someone like Ralph Waterty for a long time, he was notorious for also saying, I'm an artist who happens to be Māori. He didn't want to be a Māori artist, but I never saw that as a denial of his kind of Māori self. But what he was saying with that was that's not the only way to read my work, and that he was engaged on so many different levels. And I think there was a whole thing, and there still is at times, in New Zealand anyway, of artists who are of Māori extraction, but, you know, see themselves as contemporary artists and didn't want to be reduced by those ideas. Not that I believe you necessarily are reduced by those ideas, it's just the boxes that you're talking about. In New Zealand, I still think you can have cultural specificity, even like Indigenous, to me, doesn't have to be a homogenous kind of term. I think Indigeneity is a shifting kind of concept and is obviously defined differently in different places. And when I talked about cultural specificity in terms of those two particular artists, I'm saying that they're very different and they have their own cultural specificity, which goes back to iwi, or even there's even smaller kind of categories like hapu, which are sub-tribes, which perhaps are apparent because they're within their work anyway, and it's part of who and what they are as individuals and as human beings. But that it's not, again, a homogenous kind of idea. I think there's distinct kind of things within that. In the same way that I can't begin to understand everything that happens here, I have a different kind of frame of reference. I think there are connectors. And I don't think it's just through kind of a colonial kind of experience either. I think there are connectors that go further back and in different directions than that. I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I really don't see it as a limiting. I see it as a really important kind of opportunity. In New Zealand, I'm a curator of contemporary Māori and Indigenous art, whatever that means, again, whatever that means. But what it means for me, I suppose, is that those Māori artists have a broader kind of international context, that there might be people or other artists who work with similar ideas or themes that kind of contextualise their work in a very different way. So instead of going like this, it's kind of like this. So for me, it's a important connector, and it's extraordinary to go from one place to another and to see kind of a similar path chosen or work that has a resonance on completely different sides of the world. I was really interested when Greg Hill came to New Zealand and he showed me Carl Beam's catalogue. I had no idea who Carl Beam was. And to me, he was very similar to someone like Ralph. Although Ralph worked with black, Carl Beam worked with white, but the solutions that they came up with in terms of their practice was very similar, yet they probably had no idea of one another. So I actually found that quite profound and quite extraordinary.
So my question is for Gerald. Hi, Gerald, again. You spoke about, you began with speaking about the linguistics and study of the Navajo language. And I just wanted to know from, in terms of a body as receptacle and worldview, these ideas that language holds the meanings of the actions and the events that are sometimes found in original words, which are sometimes found in the creation stories, for example. So I just wanted to ask you about how you draw meaning from that language or the study of linguistics, and as it translates also to the gestures that artists do and objects that we create and we imbue with certain amount of our mental energy.
I wish I could answer a good question like that. With the greatest respect, those are wonderful entrapment questions. And I like them. I don't answer to words. I create a sense of presence with words that is to my writing. That's not true right now, although maybe to an extent. I have to emphasize here, I have a great difficulty answering questions because they're the very words that we're talking about and they can't be answered. And it's not suitable here to play academic, but if I knew the answer to that, if you knew the answer to that question, you wouldn't ask it that way. And that's a playback for classrooms, but it works sometimes when I don't know the answer. But I'll try to talk about it. I have to discover it, and I don't mean discovery in the colonial sense. I mean, it's a surprise to me sometimes, and you all know this. You read a book, and then 10 years later you read it again, and you wonder, what the hell did I think was good about that book? And then 10 years after that, you read it a second time, and you think, oh, work of genius. And so what is it that happens to me, to you, when we hear or read words in a different context with different and more complex experience? And that's, I think, what is my creative sense. And you would think, therefore, as I'm getting close to the end here, not this conference, but my life, as I get closer to the end, I'd have more insights. I'm not so sure. I just have different stories. And they build on the things I have thought about. For instance, here's a loving discovery story, and then I'll stop. My grandmother married a blind man after her husband dumped her from the reservation. She married a blind man who was 20-some years younger. And I came home from service leave in the military and was really proud to wear a uniform, so I was hoping I'd be noticed. No. She dragged me into the kitchen and said, "Don't you tell him what I look like." Well, of course I said I would never do that, but then about an hour or two later I realized I had some power for the first time in the context of my loving relationship with Alice. I never exploited it. Alice and her blind man would, once a week or so, take a bus to the suburbs in Minneapolis. They'd get off at the last stop, walk down the street, knock on a couple of doors, would never get more than the second or third door when some lonely woman would drag them in for lunch and talk about families and show photographs. And so when I'd see my grandmother in the weekend, I'd say, "Well, who'd you meet this time?" I mean, it was really interesting, but I didn't fully grasp it for probably 10 years or more. And then thinking about it, I realized this extraordinary woman was going to the suburbs to do social work. They never sold a broom. That was his business. And they were doing social work. And it gave her great meaning. And I'm sorry to say I didn't realize the power of that until after she died. She's going to the suburbs. Let me tell you one other sweet story, that she loved surprises too. And this is how my life has been going, because everything I've done in my life is by chance, except the stupid stuff. Quite a load of stupid stuff, but I managed to duck it pretty well. Anyway, come over to eat, and Alice pulls out a couple of cans with no labels on them. And "What vegetable would you like, Jerry?" I say, "Well, what are they?" She said, "I don't know." It's a surprise. She and her man went to a place called Banks, where they sold damaged goods, in fires at supermarkets and stuff. And the cheapest products were the ones where the labels were burned off. It'd be a penny or two a can. So they'd load up on that, not altogether because it was cheap, but because, frankly, they kind of liked the surprise. And it was corn or beans or peas or something. It probably didn't matter. It all tasted the same. Thanks very much.
Sorry, I would sorry to say, Director Nathan Gary of Canada. Actually, you are asking something, but I am going wrong, because I was so sorry. I felt with my uncle, and of course my heart broken works. And first time I gave this kind of big lecture, yeah, of course I did somehow in Delhi or somewhere, but really I'm so sorry. Next time, of course, I will do. Thank you. So